Now, there's quite a lot to get in the next 6 minutes, 19 seconds, because I'm going to start off by talking about the history of religious persecution in 18th century Ireland, which you all want to know about, and then I'm going to show how that applies to learning today. Now, in a Pecha Kucha, there isn't really a lot of time for interaction with the audience, so we'll start with a quiz. There are going to be 4 pictures, and you have to say which is the odd one out, just like Have I Got News For You. The first picture is a school. It happens to be the second school I ever taught at in Chesterfield, but that's not relevant. It's a school. And the second picture is a Moodle course that Di and I recently designed for some people we're working with. And the third picture is a laser beam. A laser beam. And the final picture is a rock in the middle of a field in County Cork in Ireland. And you have to say which of these 4 pictures is the odd one out. There's time to ask a question, but there isn't time to ask for an answer, so I'll tell you. The odd one out is the laser beam, because all the others are places you can go to learn. School is obviously a place to go to learn. Moodle course is a virtual online place you can go to learn. A laser beam isn't a place you can go to learn, but if you want to know what's going wrong in higher education today, said he self-righteously, you need to look at how laser beams were developed in the 1950s. Ask me about it later. And the final picture, the rock, is actually the location of a hedge school in Ireland. And the hedge schools are what I'm going to be talking about. Do you know, I've got 5 seconds ahead of myself. That's amazing. So, as I was saying, the final picture is a hedge school. Thank you very much. And what happened in 18th century Ireland is that there were lots of laws that discriminated, not just against Catholics, but against many nonconformist religions. And one of those laws effectively outlawed education by or for Catholics. So it was an outlawed activity. So what the local people did, the very poor Catholic people in Ireland, they valued education, so they clubbed together and they paid a teacher to create a hedge school. In other words, they just paid a teacher directly to teach in secret places where they couldn't be found out by the authorities. Quite often, they would just teach under the shelter of a hedge, hence the name hedge schools, or it might be in the shelter of a rocky outcrop, as you saw, or sometimes, actually more often than not, it was actually in a building, in a barn or something like that. Now, I'm sure the quality of the teaching varied an awful lot, but they were successful. They concentrated on the 3 R's, as you might expect, but, interestingly enough, Greek and Latin were taught in the hedge schools, and even navigation was taught in one hedge school, and it was not unknown for people to be taught in a hedge school, for children to be taught in a hedge school, and then to go on to university, not in Ireland, of course. Now, the thing is, I believe there is a direct comparison between what happened in Ireland in the 18th century and what is happening in England now, because the government is withdrawing its support now, as then, for a whole category of education and for a whole category of learner. And the people who are having support withdrawn from them now are anybody over the age of 19 who wants to learn anything that is not deemed very narrowly to be economically useful. I was privileged over 40 years ago to do a degree in music, some of you know. If I was a young person today contemplating doing a music degree in the next year or so, I would have to pay virtually the entire economic cost of that, and it's a disgrace. But what I'm suggesting is that maybe the way to deal with this disgraceful situation is for us to go, I'm nearly there, thank you, for us to go back to the 18th century and for groups of adults to contract directly with teachers to do the teaching, and for those teachers to use digital media as part of that. And in fact, we have 4 advantages over the original digital hedge schools. First of all, as we heard just before the break, learning resources are now available virtually free of charge. Actually, the cost of books was one of the main problems that affected the original hedge schools in Ireland. Secondly, communication is virtually free of charge. We don't have to have the overhead of a wandering scholar going from hedge to hedge to find different learners. Through Skype, etc., we can do that. Learners have more disposable income. Now, that may seem a strange thing to say in these very tight times, but the people in Ireland were living in abject poverty, and yet some of them put together a few pence to pay the teacher. Things are better now. And finally, it's going to on off now there, it doesn't matter if it rains in a virtual Hedge school or an online Hedge school. An interesting fact about the original Hedge schools was that each school was very much based around the person and the personality of an individual teacher. And when Hedge schools became slightly more formalised in the 19th century and had buildings, they would be called Mr. So-and-so School or Miss So-and-so School. And, do you know, I worry that online learning these days can be a very impersonal experience, and I think we should be putting into the foreground the actual personality of the teacher who is going to work with people, rather than thinking of online learning as being something that is very distant and consistent, people sitting in front of a computer pressing a few buttons. So, I'll leave you with two questions. The first, is this digital Hedge school idea a viable model for adult learning in these mean times? Might one way in which we deal with the situation be to forget about institutions, forget about government funding, and contract directly with teachers? And there's some evidence that it works. And secondly is, do we need to attach more importance to the personality of the individual teacher? Because if you think about what works really well online, like Twitter and blogs, and to some extent Facebook, it's very much about individuals. The end.